Hey everybody, I'm excited to share with you some of my notes from my study over the last several weeks from the book of Matthew. Hopefully this will just supplement your own study as you begin to teach on the book of Matthew. These are just some interesting things that I found I thought would be helpful for you. So here's a map that I found through Logos of the area context of Matthew during the time of Matthew. So sometimes we see maps from different time periods. Of course, the geography hasn't changed too much, but here's a map with some of the names that you might recognize as you read through the book of Matthew, which I thought was helpful. And I just zoomed in on it here. If you want, you can look back and reference this video. And as you read, you can kind of look through and see some of the names that are mentioned. One of the things I just thought I would mention is it's amazing how many names some of these places have sometimes. So just keep that in mind. The Sea of Galilee, for example, you might see that called the Lake of Tiberias. I'm not sure if these names actually are in Matthew. Come to think of it, they may very well be, but it is a lake, by the way, so that's interesting. You know, we call it the Sea of Galilee. So often we think of sea as the ocean or a salt sea or something. That's the Hebrew name. It's also, you'll see the Sea of Chinnereth, and it's also been called the Lake of Gennesaret. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but I know this is a soft G here. Gennesaret, I think it is. So just keep in mind that a lot of times these places have a lot of different names. Here is a map of the area. Again, I just wanted to show you, I've done this before, but I think sometimes we have a hard time grasping this because we don't live in these areas, how far away things are. So if here's the Sea of Galilee, you know, Jerusalem being somewhere down here, sometimes in the book you'll hear that they traveled from Galilee and they went to Jerusalem. And it's nice if we have a map in our heads, we start to develop that to kind of understand, you know, how long it took them to travel different places. And so if this is Israel, I overlapped North Carolina on here so we could kind of see how big it is. So, you know, it's gone up and down in my mind as to how big this region is, because in some ways it's pretty small. You know, and in other ways it's actually amazing how much they did travel, despite, you know, this being a small area. You know, when we think of highways or we think of planes traveling through the sky. But if you look at this distance, even from Sea of Galilee to the Jerusalem area, you know, measure that distance and you think of like Charlotte being here and like how much of a distance that is. That's quite a ways for people to walk. We have a hard time, you know, walking to our driveway sometimes. So just to keep that in mind, like, man, how much they were traveling, it was a lot. I put this map in here as well of Jerusalem. You could reference this. I'm not going to go into detail here, but showing the temple here and you know, what it may have looked like in New Testament times. You can pause the video if you need to kind of look at these other areas. Here's something that I found. Let me see if I can go back here. I just found this to be a really interesting quote by D.A. Carson. And I think it helps me to see a biblical scholar really just helping us think about oral tradition differently. We think about how information was passed from generation to generation verbally a lot of the time. And I think because of the way that we think of like verbal things today, like we think of like rumors and we think of like the game of telephone, how, oh, things must have been so corrupted. Well, when you depend on that, actually, culture used to be a lot more careful. And in fact, they memorized things way more than we did, memorizing the entire first 5 books of the Bible, for example. And I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here for those that are watching this video, but I think it's good to keep in mind that according to D.A. Carson, at least oral traditions, especially religious religious oral traditions, are not conducive to tampering and falsification, but are remarkably stable. And I think one example of why that's true, you know, if you have many people who are memorizing the same thing, if one person deviates from that, it's easy to tell the deviation, and it's not easy for that person to continue. They would be corrected by a community who knew an exact memorized oral tradition. So I think that's important when we get into the book of Matthew and how information was passed down. Here's another fact, and this is getting into apologetics, and I'm not one to. I think Dave Carson is probably a presuppositional apologetics person, where we believe, God is the one who has to convince us of truth. So it's a miracle that we believe the truths of the Bible. However, God also created reason, logic, and reason. So we do look at things like this. But this is a really amazing paragraph. I encourage you to pause the video and read this carefully. I'm just going to read this first sentence because it's kind of a mind blower. If the assumption was that no one ever wrote history for the sake of accuracy, then no fraudulent history could ever be written with the expectation that it would be believed. In other words, people wrote history for accuracy. And sometimes there's an argument out there that, people were just writing whatever they wanted, and, they'd fabricate whatever they felt like fabricating, and that was that. If that was the assumption, then nobody could actually write history at all for anybody to believe it, because nobody would there'd be no expectation for anybody to believe that. So he expands on that a little bit in this paragraph. So I just thought that would be fun for you all to read. This is just about authorship, and you could read the whole thing, but my main point was that the objections to the authorship being anyone else from Matthew do not appear to be substantial. And then a note about the date. This is probably the most convincing reason for the date being before 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, Rome really moved in and took over. Matthew records more warnings against the Sadducees than all other New Testament writers combined. And after 70 AD, the Sadducees no longer existed as a center of authority. So Matthew is writing to the Sadducees, or combating the Sadducees, wouldn't make any sense if they were not around, or I'm trying to think of a different word and it's not coming to my mind, but inconsequential, or anyway, he wouldn't be writing to them if they weren't around during that time. And in fact, scholars are estimating that Matthew was probably written in the 60s sometime. And I just wanted to pause and reflect on that for a second, just to kind of maybe as a so what, who cares kind of thing. That anyone in their 20s when Jesus was crucified would only be in about their 50s when Matthew was written. So 50 years old, it's not too old. You remember quite a lot of things. And so I sometimes people will make the fact about how late some of this was written And how accurate could it have been? But actually, things were actually written down a lot sooner, and this is when a lot of those things that have already been written were actually compiled. Um, and we talked about oral tradition, and the way that people pass down information was to actually have things memorized word for word. And so you'll see creeds and things where these things were memorized and passed down. And so 60s is about the date for Matthew. Another note on the authenticity of the prophecies and and Matthew in general. I'll just read this. The very difficulty of the links between story and Old Testament text argues against the creation of the stories, because created stories would have eliminated the most embarrassing strains. And so, there's details that were given that are just not things that you would say if you're trying to convince people of fiction. And one example I think we all remember is how the first people to find Jesus's tomb empty was a group of women, which during that time doesn't help your case. But if it's true and you're writing about true things, you write about things like that. And so that's one small example. Just some themes, major themes. I think these 5 are probably the most prominent major themes of the book of Matthew. The Messiah, Emmanuel, God is with us, God, the suffering servant through Christ, the kingdom of heaven in general, that it's here, that it's also coming, and God's presence, particularly his presence through Jesus, and Jesus's own omnipresence in his knowledge, Jesus's own knowledge, and his miracles. Some maybe sub points or sub themes would be discipleship and the kingdom being an upside down kingdom, some kingdom you wouldn't expect, where the king acts as a servant, and how we are all supposed to act that way as well. What the last slide here, this is maybe just a difficult scripture, or some have made it more difficult than it probably needs to be. But I'll just read Matthew 10:23. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, I think maybe it's just me that I see posts on either Twitter or Facebook or Instagram with atheists or people who are just wanting to tear down Christianity, and they feel like they've somehow got a good scripture here to say, even people say, look, Jesus lied. See, look, he said that they wouldn't have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man came, and then he didn't come, and Israel was taken over, and so it didn't happen. And I found this quote from D.A. Carson helpful, where he acknowledges that this verse is among the most difficult in the New Testament canon, but the coming of the Son of Man here refers to his coming in judgment against the Jews, culminating in the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So they will not have finished evangelizing the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes in judgment on Israel, which actually happened in 70 AD. So, just there are interesting details like that I think are important for us to keep in mind. This was all that I had for you today. I hope this was helpful in some way. Let me know if you've got any comments, questions, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.